There we go. Okay. Good morning. Our learning is Lili Nishmas Mindel Mari Mas Kalman Ruven. Her neshama should have an aliyah. We are all the way on the bottom of Ayin Testament Beis. The last three words on the page, they are a quote from the Mishnah, and we're speaking about, again, we're still in the middle of discussing different things that a person carries into Rishus Harabim, and the discussion is the measurements. How much of the item do you carry in order to be chayav achatas? Okay, so the last words of the Mishnah is diyo. When it comes to ink, kidei lichtov, enough to write, and the Mishnah said enough to write 2 letters. Okay, so the Gemara quotes a brisa which elaborates on this a little bit. It says Tana, when we taught in a brisa, shtei osios b'diyai, one is liable for taking out 2 letters worth of dried ink, ushtei osios b'komis, or 2 letters worth of ink in a quill, shtei osios b'kalmarin, or 2 letters worth of ink in an inkwell. The inkwell is the thing you're taking the ink from. Bottom line is, the Mishnah is the brisa is telling us that doesn't matter. It doesn't mean no matter how you carry the ink, it's still going to be enough to write 2 letters. It's worth noting, the poskim point out, there is actually a difference between the 2 letters of dry ink on its own, to in a quill and to an inkwell, and that is because if anytime you're taking ink out of something else, you're going to need to have a little extra, because if you're pulling it out of an inkwell, you're never going to, you could scrape the bottom of the jug or the bottom of the jar as much as you want, you're always going to miss something. In other words, it's impossible to get it out entirely. So when we say 2 of an inkwell, it's enough to get 2 letters worth of writing from it. But of course, by definition, there's always going to be a little bit there. And the same with the ink. You think when your pen is done with its ink, there's still some ink that's stuck on the side. So it means enough with whatever substance presumably is going to be left over. Okay. By Rava. Rava asked the following question. Os achas b'dio. Let's say you have 1 letter of ink on its own. Os achas b'komis. 1 letter in a quill. Os achas b'kalmarin, and 1 in an inkwell. Okay. Mahu. What's the halach about them being combined? In other words, do the 2 need to be together in the same thing, or can they be combined? 1 dried and 1 in a quill, or 1 in a quill and 1 in an inkwell, or 1 in an inkwell and 1 in dried. Can they combine? The Gemara leaves it unresolved. Teku, that is the Gemara's answer. We do not know. Was that really considered seen as one thing, or by the fact that they're in separate places, is that considered separate? Okay. Amarava, new halacha. Yeah.
Why in this case? It seems interesting that there wouldn't be any sort of...
What do you mean?
They didn't decide that there wouldn't be any resolution. Just, I don't know, it seems like it's... Why would this be so unknown? Maybe yes, maybe no. There could be somebody who has an opinion. There's no tradition about it. It seems strange that this would be one that would be... It doesn't seem like you couldn't resolve it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting.
It's not a very strong question. It's more of just, you go through and see where Teku ends up happening. It just seems like it would be...
I hear. Okay. It's a good doctorate thesis to focus on. No, okay, I'm not sure. You're right. Okay, I have to know what are the unresolved questions on or not. And yeah, fair observation. Amar Rava. Says Rava, Hotzi shtei osios uchsavan shu mahalach. Okay, so the following scenario, where we're talking about Hotza over here. Again, it's a confusing case because there's 2 things that are happening at the same time. One is, you're not allowed to write letters. You're not allowed to write on Shabbos. Also, you're not allowed to carry on Shabbos. So let's say while I'm writing, while I'm walking, I'm writing. Okay, so what happens in that time? So I'm chayav for writing, but in addition, I'm also depositing the ink that I was carrying as I'm writing. Right? So as I'm walking, I'm writing, right? So chayav, in that case, the person is chayav, ksivasan zohi hanachasan, because the writing is the placement. Okay, v'amarava, hotzi os achas uchsava, a person took out a letter's worth of ink and wrote it, v'chazer v'hotzi os achas uchsava, then took out another letter and wrote it, okay? Pater, you're exempt. Now, why would you be exempt? Even though they're done within the same period of time, the same period of forgetting, normally you would combine things and you'd say you're chayav achatas. My time, what's the reason? Because if there's a lapse of time between the first letter and the second letter, then by the time you get to the second letter, the measurement of the first letter is already lacking. Okay, so if you ever watch a sofer at work, they put a lot of ink. In your typical writing, in your minimalistic type of writing, it actually shrinks a little bit, and you actually don't have, the ink dries, and therefore you don't have enough there. So typically the sofer is going to put a lot of ink, a good amount of ink, in order to make sure the letter is there. But the bottom line is that in this case, if you wrote a letter and then you went away, and then you go back and write a letter, and then the first letter is going to shrink, and you really don't have enough for 2 letters in your typical case. If I wrote just a bare minimum of letter number 1, and then I paused for a while, then I came back into number 2, we could assume the first letter shrunk, and therefore you're not going to be chayav achatas in that case because you didn't actually put down 2 letters. In other words, because again, to carry, you have to carry the amount that is needed for 2 full letters, and by the time it dries, it actually becomes a little bit less than 1 letter. Rava adds a seemingly similar halacha. Hotzi chatzi gurgeres achas v'nicha. If a person takes out food in the amount of a half of a dried fig's volume, places it down, v'chazer v'hotzi chatzi gurgeres achas v'nicha, and then goes down and puts down another half. Rishona nasa k'mi sheklata kelev. Osha nisrifa. The first half that was first put down is as if a dog ate it or that it got burnt, upater, and therefore the person is exempt. And the Gemara asks, Vamai, why should he be exempt? Hamancha, it's still there. In other words, these cases are not similar. In the case of the ink, it shrunk. But over here, I put down half a thing of cereal, half a fig measurement of cereal, and then I come back an hour later, put another half thing of cereal. It's as if it got burnt. It's not burnt, it's here. What's the Gemara talking about? So, Hachika Amar, this is what it means. Vim kadam vigbia rishona. If a person put it down and then picked it up, okay, before the second half was put down, before the other half of the measurement was put down, then nasas rishona kamishin nilkatosh nisrifa, then it's as if it was caught by a dog and swallowed or burnt up, upater, you'd be exempt. In other words, they have to still be resting on the ground in order for a person to be chayav, which presumably is pretty straightforward. Rava. Okay, so this case, so the Gemara, what Rav is telling us is that in order to be chayav you could do a malacha in parts. You don't have to do a malacha all at once. I could go ahead and there are minimal measurements of carrying out in order to be chayav. So I could take, let's say again cereal. So I have the amount for cereal. Anything which wasn't specified before is a size of a fig. Okay, so whatever little thing. And so I take out a tiny bit of cereal, half a fig size, and I put it outside, and then I go back and I put half a fig size. That's fine. That's fine in the sense that that combines in order to make me chayav, because at the end of the day I took out the full portion. Rav is coming along and telling me that if I put down half, and then I picked up that half, and then I put down a second half, then it doesn't combine, because it has to actually be staying there, in order to be combined and seen as one. That's Rava's Kaddish. Vama Rava, hotzi chatzi grogeres v'nicha. A person took out half a dried fig's volume and set it down. V'chazar v'hotzi chatzi grogeres v'vira derech aleha chayav. And then he took out a second one, and this time you didn't put down the second one, but you kind of walked over the first one. You're still going to be chayav, even though you didn't put it down. So again, in this new case, Rav is saying, I take out a half a fig's worth, I put it down on the floor. And then I take a second half, and I walk over it. I don't actually put it down. I'm still going to be chayav. Ask the Gemara, Vamai, why is that? Halonach. In order to be chayav, or go back to the original halachos that we discussed when we started this masechta, you have akira, has to be leaving one domain, va'anacha, and then placing it down somewhere else. So the Gemara answers, Gon shivira toch shlosha. The answer is that it was placed within 3 tfachim on the ground, right? If you recall, we had this halacha. This comes up in a couple of places, and when something is within 3 tfachim from the ground, then it's as if it was actually placed down. Okay, it comes up in a couple of different halachos. Okay, ask the Gemara of Amar Rava, but Rava himself said, toch shlosha, that within 3 tfachim, the Rabbanan tzarach hanach lagabe mashihu. He says even when it's within 3. Granted, you don't need the regular full-fledged space for hanacha. It doesn't have to go on like a proper setting, but it would still have to rest on something. It would have to have like something that it rests on. In other words, if you recall, if you would, I would be very impressed, but about like 78 pages ago, we had a discussion about about things within 3 tefachim on the ground. There was one opinion that said, as long as it's within 3 tefachim on the ground, it's as if it's rested. Rava said no. Rava said, granted, when it's within 3 tefachim on the ground, it doesn't have to be like on a table. It doesn't have to rest on something sturdy, but it does still have to rest on something. And over here, he just told us, as long as I'm walking over and just holding it, over it, and I'm not stopping, right, then that's enough. He told us elsewhere earlier that it's even within 3 tefachim, it still has to rest on something, and over here he's not saying that. What's going on? So Gemara says, "Lo kasha kan bezoreg kan b'ma'avir." Earlier, where he said you need to have a minimal, something for it to be placed on, he's talking about where a person throws an object. Remember, there's a discussion with Kiva and Ibn Az, I think, about throwing an object from one place to another. So there was one opinion that says, as long as it's within 3 tefachim of the ground, it's as if it's on the ground. There, Rava said no, it has to rest because throwing is less sturdy. You could understand than walking. If I'm walking, by definition, walking due to the speed, due to the fact that I'm and also more importantly, the fact that I'm holding onto it. As I walk, I'm holding onto it. So there is some level of placement as long as it's within 3 tefachim on the ground. Rava says it's as if it's placed down, and therefore Rava, to go back to the halacha that Rava was telling us is if a person places half a measurement on the ground and then they walk outside later with the other half measurement, but they're holding it within 3 tefachim of the ground as they walk past it, then those two combine, and a person is going to be chayav for hotzah because they have a full measurement in that case. Okay, another brisa. Taner Rabbanan. Hotzi chati grogeres v'chazra hotzi chati grogeres behelam echad chayev. If a person takes out half a dried fig and then they take out another half a dried fig, within one period of unawareness, they are going to be chayev. That makes sense. In other words, in this we kind of alluded to, we kind of mentioned it before, and that is that you don't have to carry out the full measurement at once. As long as the two half measurements happen within the same period of time, you are going to be chayev. Okay. B'shtei halamos pater. But if they're in two separate periods of unawareness, then you're exempt. So let's say a person goes ahead, and this comes up sometimes in the Shabbos, a person goes ahead and makes a mistake, and then they're like, oh, I realize I'm not supposed to be doing that. And then they totally forget again. It happens, right? Basically, I didn't realize I wasn't allowed to do that. But it didn't happen within the same period of forgetfulness. There was a forgetting, and then an awareness, and then a forgetting. That awareness in the middle separates those two actions, right? So, an extreme example would be a person turns a light on Shabbos. Well, then that's not two halves. Whatever it is, a person does a half an action, remembers at Shabbos, and does the other half. That's an extreme case. A less extreme case, or to me would seem like more practical, is a person forgets that this thing is, to do this action is forbidden, or forgets there isn't an Erev. Let's say Erev goes down, okay? So a person goes ahead and carries something. But it's the small very thing that they carry. They have something in their pocket. It's a very small amount. They carry it. And then they realize, oh, there's the Erev. I forgot. Okay, the Erev went down. I forgot. Okay, and then they go out later in the day, again, because they're used to having an Erev, and they carry another half portion. Because it's two separate, because there's a reminder in the middle, that divides those two actions. But as long as it was within one forgetting, one unawareness, then they would be chayav achados. The two things would combine, okay? Rav Yossi adds another halacha. Rav Yossi Omer, behelam echad l'reshus echad chayav. Rav Yossi says that even when it comes to, yes, they have to be done within one period of awareness, but it has to also be done in one single domain. Okay, l'shtei reshuyos pater. But if it's two halves that are brought to two separate domains, you'd be exempt. In other words, like this, Rav Yossi is saying, let's go back to the guy who forgot that that the Erev went down, or didn't know the Erev was down, so there's a lack of awareness, and they go ahead and they carry a little baggie of cereal to one place, to the shul, okay, and they go out through their back door and they go into the public domain of that, to go to shul, and then later in the day they want to go to friend, they go out through the front door and they go out to a different public domain and carrying another baggie of cereal. Okay, baggie has like a connotation. Okay, fine. A bag, no? Okay, maybe it's just me. Okay.
That's still in one.
It's all in one forgetting. I didn't realize there was an unawareness. I didn't realize there was an Erev, but I brought one to one Rishus Harabim and the other half to another Rishus Harabim. Rav Yossi says you're not chayav in that case because it's not a complete action. The action has to be all one taking out. It could be two taking outs, but it's all into one domain. That's seen as one action. When it's l'shtei reshuyos pater, if it's two separate domains, even though they're both Rishus Harabim, but they're two separate Rishus Harabims, they don't combine. Okay, fine. So now the Gemara is going to, we'll see three opinions in terms of what Rav Yossi was referring to when he says two domains. Amar Rabba, v'hu sheyesh chiyuv chatos beinehem, aval karmelis lo. Rabba says that when we define it as two separate reshuyos, it has to be two separate reshuyos mida oraisa. In other words, it has to be like public domain, full-fledged private domain in between them, and then a public domain. But if let's say you had a public domain, and then you had a Carmelis. Remember, the Carmelis is a place which really is, let's the opposite case. A person goes from Rishus Harabim into this Rishus Yachid, and then to that Rishus Yachid. Two separate ones, and there's a Carmelis in between. So there, Rabba says, Rav Yossi would actually say it's one domain. Why? Because the Carmelis is only rabbinically seen as a public domain, but biblically, it's actually a rabbinic domain. So Rav Yossi says two Rishiyos, he means two full-fledged different Rishiyos, which are Midoraisa seen as separate. However, we'll see two different opinions. Abaya Omer Afilu Carmelis. Abaya says, on the next page, Abaya says, even a Carmelis in between them, it would still be seen as two domains of al pisla lo. But if they're separated only by a block of wood, meaning just like a fence, then they are not considered separate. V'Rav Amar afilu pisla. Even if there's just a block of wood, even if there's like this minimal thing separating the two, it would still be considered two separate domains. In other words, according to Rava, again, person forgets did not realize the air went down, and they're standing in the public domain. They pick up something and they go to the private domain. Okay, and then they pick up something from the public domain and go into another private domain. And the difference between these two private domains is just this piece of wood that stands between them. Rava says that's enough of a separation to make them two separate reshuyos, in which case you would not be chayav because they don't combine. Okay, that's the last opinion. Where does this opinion come from? The domains when it comes to Shabbos is like the domains in regards to the laws of Gittin, of divorce law. What is he referring to? What he's referring to is there's discussion Maseches Gittin about the following: a person. For a man has to give the get to a woman, and the woman has to receive the get. The woman has to hold on to the get in her own domain. So ideally, it goes into her hands. That's her domain. But let's say you have a scenario where that's not going to happen. She's not around or whatever it is. So it could go into her property. Let's say she doesn't have any property. So the husband could give her some property. So let's say you have a scenario where a husband says, I'm giving this property to my wife, and then throws the get there. Problem is he has bad aim. Okay, not a good guy. Just kidding. But he has bad aim, and it ends up on a piece of wood that's sticking out of this public domain, of this private domain. Says the Gemara, that's not, it's separate. It's seen as separate. It's not part of the domain itself. And Rava then comments and says that whatever separates domains when it comes to Gittin, the same separation is going to be seen for the laws of Shabbos, and therefore, similarly over here too, he holds that piece of wood is enough to separate the two domains, and therefore Rav Yossi would hold, and they're referring to this law of Rav Yossi, that even the most minimal type of separation, doesn't have to be like a biblical separation, or even a halachic separation regarding laws of Shabbos, even a halachic separation regarding Gittin is enough to make it a separation, and Rav Yossi would say they're separated, and therefore a person would not have to bring achatas, they would not combine together. Okay, now the Gemara goes along and analyzes another part of the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, Kechol kidei lichol ayin achas. The Mishnah said a person takes out eye paint, like I don't know, like eye shadow, whatever it is, I'm scared, whatever it is, something to make up for the eye. You're chayav if you take out enough to paint one eye. Ask the Gemara, ayin achas, holo kachli. Who paints one eye? You look like a really strange person to paint one eye. You got to paint them both. So the whole premise of all these discussions was that you're doing something which was significant, meaningful. If a person's taking enough dye, enough makeup for one eye, that's not meaningful. Rav Huna shekain snuos kochlos ayin achas, because there were certain modest women who would only paint one eye. What he's referring to is in certain areas, again, especially in their region, people would sometimes wear, I don't know, burqas or whatever it is that would cover one eye. Right, and they would only have one eye visible. So therefore, in those regions, caring for one eye was sufficient. I mean, I don't know. I don't put on makeup, but if I have my half of face covered, I would not put on makeup for the other half. Like, what would be the point of that? I'm wearing makeup for what's on the outside, right? So therefore, it would make sense to wear one. It would be meaningful to carry for one eye. Meisvei, however, there's a brayso that says not like this. Rav Shimon Elazar Omer, kechol, when it comes to eye paint, eye makeup, im l'refua, if it's for healing purposes, kidei lichol ayin achas, then you're liable to take out for one eye, because, okay, if you're using it somehow for healing purposes, then that would make sense. Im l'kashet, but if it's being used for adornment, b'shteinayim. So you see very clearly, you need for both eyes. So Targma Hillel, Bered Rabbi Shmuel, Bar Nachmani, Kitanyahu, Ranios. This second view that you need for both eyes is specifically in villages. In villages, women would not dress this way. In other words, this idea of being partially covered, of having their faces covered, was typically only a practice in big cities, which is interesting. What the Mefarshim say is that in more bustling cities, you would find more modesty. In a smaller village, there would be less modesty, not because they're less modest, but less modesty is needed. Right? It's interesting, right? Typically, you go to big cities. I haven't really thought this through, but New York City, LA, whatever it is, and typically those are the most immodest places. And the Gemara's understanding is precisely. In other words, there's something almost like immodest in the air, and therefore people want to counter that by dressing more modestly in those places, and therefore women would dress more covered up in those places because of the hustle and bustle of such places. In smaller places, which are more relaxed, there wasn't a need to be as modest, okay? And therefore, women would never cover half their face. It simply wasn't done in villages. Okay, it's a very interesting observation, something to think about. Okay, fine. A little further. Shava kedei litain al pinak of katan. When it comes to wax, enough to put on a small hole. Tana kedei litain al pinak of katan shel yain. It's a small hole of a wine barrel. Okay, we explained this when we saw the Mishnah. The Mishnah said that wax, basically what they would do is they would want to pour wine out of the barrel. They make a hole and then they plug it with a piece of wax. Okay, devek. When it comes to glue, kedei litain brosha shafshaf. It would be enough glue to place on the head of a board. What is going on over here? Why do you put glue on a board? Tana kedei litain barosh shafshaf shebarosh kana shel tzayadim. It was the head of the reed of bird trappers. Okay, there's one of the ways they trap birds is they would place glue. They would place a board and place glue. Apparently, it's still done in some places. They'd place glue, and then the bird, and probably put some feed on it, bird feed. The birds would come and they get stuck there. Okay, it's actually a decent amount of glue, right? If you put a tiny little bit, they're going to just pull themselves off. So that's the amount of glue that's needed, enough to catch birds. Okay, zephes vigafres kedei lasos. Pitch or sulfur enough to form a hole. Tana kedei lasos neck of cuts in a small hole. We already explained this in the Mishnah. What they would do is they would, if a person had mercury, they would typically use mercury for different healing purposes. So what they would do is they put it in a vial and then they cover it up with this material and then they poke a hole in it. because they'd want to pour it out in a small amount, and then they'd take a little bit more of pitch or sulfur and make a small amount as a small whole cover for the vial. Okay. Then you had at the end towards the end of the Mishnah is talked about crushed brick, enough to make an opening for the crucible. That was the gold refiners would have like this hole which they would then put in it, and they would have a fire in it. So you'd cover the brick would cover the hole, and then Rabbi Yehuda said enough to make a tripod. Now the implication, it sounds like Rabbi Yehuda, which one is demanding more brick? Rabbi Yehuda, who needs to make a tripod, or the Tanakama, who needs enough to cover just the head of the crucible? Rabbi Yehuda sounds like he's saying much more, right? So ask the Gemara, Lememra d'shira Rabbi Yehuda nafish, that the Mishnah implies his portion is larger. Hakaimalan d'shira Rabbanan nafish. But we see elsewhere, when we see machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan, we see that the Rabbanan actually have the larger portions. It's not. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Kei Litol Heimenu Midas Minal Lekatan. Okay, so we had a machlokas between the Rabbanan and Rabbi Yehuda when it came to the rope and the reed grass. That Rabbi Yehuda said it's enough to make the measure of a small child's shoe, whereas the Rabbanan just needed a hanging loop for a sifter or sieve. So Rabbi Yehuda was Rabbi Yehuda's measurements was smaller, and therefore that would seem to be, and yet over here, Rabbi Yehuda's measurement is larger. There's an assumption over here that Rabbi Yehuda is going to be consistent. And Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan, when they argue there's going to be a consistency between them, that Rabbi Yehuda, presumably, just like in one place, he clearly has the smaller measurements. So here too, he should have the smaller measurement, and yet over here, he seems to have the much larger measurements that he demands enough crushed brick to make a tripod. So the Gemara answers, pitput hira ketana. What it means is to close up the cracks in the tripod of a small stove. We're not talking about making an actual tripod, which would be large, but rather it's to close up the cracks, and therefore there is no stira. In both cases, Rabbi Yehuda it's a much smaller measurement than the Rabbanan, and therefore there is consistency. We will stop here. Okay, have a great day. And an easy fast for those fasts.